Hello, I'm Len Rydell, the Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society. I'd like to welcome you to our presentation by Bill Matter on the battles around Spotsylvania, which is part of our third symposium that we held back in May of 1995. As I mentioned in the introduction to this, we had about 6 or 7 lectures that were going to be tied together, and unfortunately, we lost 3 of them. The quality just wasn't there, or they got cut and chopped and whatever. And sadly, we lost Gordon Ray's fine presentation on the wilderness, and so I am going to have a little longer introduction on this to set up Bill Matter's talk, which will follow on Spotsylvania. So if you indulge me with this, you will probably find this to be 10 minutes, maybe. I'm not sure yet. I'm speaking off the cuff. We'll see how it goes. But before I do that, to lead you in and talk about the wilderness and so forth, Bill Matter was retired up in and around Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and nobody had ever tackled the Overland Campaign in a comprehensive fashion. And the battles around Spotsylvania, just like some of the battles around the wilderness, were particularly complex. They're hard to understand. And because they went on for multiple days, it took somebody to sit down and try to grind all this out. And Bill had all the book knowledge that needed to be to support this. And he was fascinated endlessly with Spotsylvania. But as I mentioned in my overall introduction, Bill wrote intellectually dense books. Didn't mean they were bad books. It was a very good book. It was just a very hard book to read. I call them Velcro books, where there's so much detail presented on each page that it is hard to turn from page to page, and you oftentimes feel like you're beaten up a little bit. So instead of reading rapidly for pleasure and enjoyment, you find that you have to read 3, 4, 5 pages and then put it down because you've been mentally beaten up and worked out. So Bill's book, I think it's entitled "If It Takes All Summer," was printed by the University of North Carolina Press and is no longer in print. I think you would have to look for it on a secondary market. And I don't not recommend it, although I would say that if you had your choice between reading Gordon Ray's pithy and comprehensive and fine narrative, and you could only read one book, I'd read Gordon's book on the battles of Spotsylvania. But if you want to get a lot of the detail and other stuff, by all means, find a copy of Bill's book and read it. So, and he'll follow me in about an hour-long talk after I finish with my talk. And I think I even do a little bit of an introduction contemporary. Again, you might not recognize it because that person introducing Bill and me don't look the same by any stretch of the imagination. It was 25 years ago, 25 and a half years ago that I gave that introduction. So in the meantime, let me give you a little setup information to work with Bill's lecture on Spotsylvania. U.S. Grant had taken command of the Union armies. He had been brought from command in the West to Washington, D.C., and had accepted promotion to the rank of lieutenant general in March of 1864, after he had outlined for Lincoln's chief of staff, Henry Halleck, who really wasn't a managing chief of staff of the Army or commanding general. Lincoln had found him frustrating, and Grant is brought and is elevated above Halleck, who only has 2 stars, but outranked Grant. So Grant is elevated to the rank of lieutenant general after he articulates a strategy that is satisfactory to the Lincoln administration. Lincoln's got 2 considerations. The first is he's got a wildfire that's really out of control. He's into early 1864, and '63 has not been a good year for the Union forces, and Lincoln has got a presidential election coming up. So bad is the situation is that the Republican Party is overtly and actively looking for somebody to replace Lincoln on the ticket because they believe that Lincoln is probably going to be defeated. Indeed, Lincoln later in this year, after the bloodshed of the Overland Campaign and the Atlanta Campaign and the failures in the Shenandoah Valley, is so disheartened that he writes in August, he writes a letter that he folds over and asks all of his cabinet members to sign blindly. And in that, he says basically that the results of the past few months have made it increasingly clear that this administration will not be returned to office in November, and therefore it will be our duty to do everything in our power to save the Union between now and the inauguration in March of 1865, because the Democrat candidate will have been elected on terms that will make it impossible for him to save the Union afterwards. And so, in effect, what Lincoln asks for is a commitment to go all out and not stop working until inauguration day of March 1865. Of course, we know what history tells us after that, so that's not that big of an issue. But at the time, it's a big issue for Lincoln. And Lincoln, because of that, is concerned about somebody who may have political ambitions. Winfield Scott had been successful in the Mexican War and sought the presidential nomination in 1852. Zachary Taylor had been a war hero and been elected president. Andrew Jackson had been a war hero and elected president. George Washington, of course, was the father of the country, had been elected president. James Madison, James Monroe were both war heroes who ended up being a president of the United States. And so Lincoln had ample cause to fear that an ambitious general officer who had been successful might be willing to use that success as a springboard to run against him for the presidency. And indeed, that's precisely what happens, although not successful. George McClellan, after he is fired in the fall of 1862 and sent home to New Jersey, is resurrected and becomes the candidate of the Democrat Party to oppose Lincoln in the 1864 election. So Lincoln had some concerns about that. And Grant's successes at Vicksburg and Donelson and Henry, where he had gotten the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant, made him an attractive figure. And when Grant sweeps the hills, Missionary Ridge, and Lookout Mountain of the Confederates in November of 1863, he's looking pretty good. And he's the only really successful general out there. And so Lincoln is concerned that Grant may have political ambitions. So in screening Grant for this promotion, Lincoln first finds out and assures himself that Grant has no political ambitions. Interesting, as Grant will become the president in 1869. But he also then asks for his solution. And unfortunately, initially, Grant fails the first test until he's given the cheat sheet. He comes up with a plan that looks remarkably like George McClellan's 1862 Peninsula Campaign, in which what Grant basically wants to do is he wants either to go in through North Carolina, cut off the Wilmington-Weldon Railroad to cut off supplies to Richmond, and basically force Lee to come after him to fight for his supply lines. Grant is quickly told that's the wrong answer, and then he's given the cheat sheet, which basically is that Lincoln expects Grant to destroy the Confederates' war-making capability, to go after their armies and defeat their armies decisively in the field. And so Grant comes up with an overall strategy to engage the Confederate forces on simultaneous fronts simultaneously, on multiple fronts simultaneously. In the Shenandoah Valley, southwestern Virginia, to break up the interior railroad, the Tennessee and Virginia Railroad that runs to Lynchburg out of Knoxville, to go against and cut the Confederacy yet again, going through Atlanta, cutting off the last ports in Mobile and elsewhere, and basically carving it up and making it impossible for the Confederates to release soldiers from unengaged theaters and move them to theaters where they can be utilized as force multipliers. Grant had seen firsthand how this had happened when Lee had released James Longstreet in September of 1863 to go west to reinforce Braxton Bragg, resulting in the victory at Chickamauga. Longstreet subsequently fails his leadership tests, but certainly Grant is cognizant of the ability of the Confederacy to move forces, substantial forces, on interior lines of communication rapidly to shore up threatened positions within the Confederacy. And so Grant's plan for the spring of 64 is to engage simultaneously on multiple fronts to exhaust the Confederates' capacity to make war. And hang in there with me on this, because this does tie into Spotsylvania directly. Grant, after he organizes this, makes the determination that since the ace of the Confederate team is Robert E. Lee, that he specifically has to take care of Lee. And this is a lesson he learned again from past experiences. When Lee goes north in 1863, in June of 63, to go into Pennsylvania, Joe Hooker, who's in command of the army at the time, figures he's willing to swap queens, to use a chess term. If Lee's going north, then that opens up the route for Hooker to go from Fredericksburg directly to Richmond. And by virtue of going to Richmond, who will blink first? Will Lee come back to defend Richmond, or will Meade go back to defend Washington? And of course, Hooker go back to defend Washington. And history tells us exactly what happened. Hooker proposes to go south. Lincoln says absolutely not. Move north. Go out and protect us. Hooker miscalculates and is replaced on the verge of what will be the Battle of Gettysburg. And Meade goes and he defends Washington and Baltimore to ensure that Lee doesn't backdoor his way into DC and force the federal government to evacuate. And so Grant understands that it's important to keep Robert E. Lee gainfully employed and to keep him from possibly creating mischief. And so after Grant aligns everything, he makes the determination, gets Lincoln's permission to run the war from the field, traveling with George Gordon Meade's Army of the Potomac. And so Grant goes down to Culpeper and he aligns from there. Now, he does a very noble thing. He had every right, of course, being the ranking officer, to take command of the army because he certainly ranked Gordon Meade, who was only Major General. But Grant did not wish to humiliate Meade that way. Meade was a good officer. He had done good things in the past 8 or 9 months, and Grant found that if he was going to run the war, he didn't necessarily need to have the responsibility for the day-to-day details. So he leaves Meade in command, but stays because he is also brought back from the West another man who ranks George Meade, and that is Ambrose Burnside. Burnside had failed in 1862 in his short tenure as commander of the Army of the Potomac, but he now ranked George Gordon Meade, and he comes back with his Ninth Corps. And while Burnside would be very affable, and never vote his rank, Grant found it necessary to stay with the Army to ensure that there was no question of seniority and who was in command. So Grant, with his 3 stars being with the Army, would always be in command, even if he gave Meade latitude to do what he needed to do. And he was also there in case Burnside suddenly had a hissy and decided he wanted to vote his seniority. This would also be particularly important once Grant got down and laid siege around Petersburg, and the Army of the Potomac is joined with the Army of the James under the command of the most senior major general in the Army and the most political officer in the Army, Benjamin Butler. So Grant's decisions to move forward are pretty impressive. And when he decides to go forward, he's got his first challenge he's got is his logistics line. His supplies to support an army of over 100,000 men is almost 100 miles long. It goes all the way down what today is U.S. Route 29, all the way to the D.C. area, and moves along the Orange and Alexandria Railroad and wagons and so forth. And so the first order of business for Grant is he's going to have to find another line of communication if he's going to move against Lee and move against the Army, because he's positioned in a manner in which he's already seen where Burnside failed around Fredericksburg. And so he realized that Lee, with the high ground on the opposite side, is not going to allow Grant to shift the army to Fredericksburg again. So Grant's going to have to fight his way. He's going to have to pound his way through and then move to a position where he can then get his supplies back on the water again, using the Potomac and Aquia Creek Landing and so forth. So Grant doesn't have much of a choice. He's going to have to cross the Rapidan River, which he does, and which Lee sees him coming, because Lee is sitting 20 miles away, but atop Clark Mountain, he can see for 30, 40 miles, and he can see the movement from the federal encampments. And so as Grant moves to cross the river, Lee moves along what today is Route 20, Virginia 20, and that is the Culpeper Turnpike, or the Orange Turnpike, rather, excuse me. And he moves, and as Grant moves into the wilderness, Lee slams into him in early May. The wilderness is made particularly intriguing because it's old growth forest that has been cut a couple of times to support smelting operations in and around the area. There's gold in the area, and there's also the need to build smelters or coal and so forth. And so this hardwood that had been present in the Virginia Piedmont area had all been cut down several times. And if you were outside the town of Fredericksburg or some of these towns, you were really truly in the country, and there were just a few roads that went through them. And with all the timber having been cut once or twice, it was growing back again, but it wasn't significant. These were not mature trees. In most instances, the growth might be 10, 12, 15 feet high. The trees were relatively immature, and because they weren't necessarily heavily farmed, there was a lot of undergrowth within the trees and stuff. And so it certainly earned the nickname the wilderness, because to go through that would break up formations, be very difficult. So anybody going along those roads needed basically to stay on the roads. If they didn't stay on the roads, they would find themselves quickly dissembled and unable to maintain any march order. And so Lee, understanding that, because Lee had been down there in 62 and 63 and had fought at Chancellorsville, knew the intersecting roads, knew what he could do, knew what was necessary to do. And so when Lee slams into Grant, Grant finds himself having to hold tenaciously to the roads so that he can maintain his manner of movement to shift his base of supply. But the price he's going to pay is 2 days of terrible, terrible fighting in the wilderness, in which the dry leaves of the winter were just in the spring, and there's a lot of dead leaves that have fallen to the ground that are just like leaves today. As I do this in November, so many leaves on the ground, it doesn't take much to light those things off. And so the battle is horrific, and it's fought in segments where corps of Lee's got 3 corps, and they all have separate areas of their own battlefield, with James Longstreet being Lee's most experienced corps commander, Lee using him to basically try to turn Grant from the east and prevent Grant from moving towards a more amenable supply wagon or supply train, because Lee knows that Grant has got a supply problem. Lee doesn't have any problems understanding where Grant is going, because he knows that Grant has to feed that army, and so he knows that he has to move toward the Potomac and Rappahannock rivers. And so it doesn't take a genius to figure that out. And most everything Lee does in the early stages of the Overland Campaign is designed towards moving to deny Grant the means of moving and getting those lines of communication and supply reestablished. And so after 2 days of fighting, in which the woods catch fire, and Grant pays a horrific butcher bill, as does Lee, and worse for Lee, he pays a huge price because he loses, just as he lost Jackson the year before, he loses Longstreet, who's seriously wounded in the wilderness and will have to recuperate until the spring of 65, requiring Lee to reach deep down into his reserves and look for more corps commanders. He also has a problem in that his other 2 corps commanders, Richard Ewell and A.P. Hill, are both ill, as is Lee. Lee has got heart problems. He's got some stomach problems as well, but mostly angina. A.P. Hill, his 3rd Corps commander, has been disappointing. He was very disappointing in the Mine Run campaign and at the Battle of Bristoe Station. And he's suffering from the advanced effects of syphilis, tertiary effects of syphilis, which he caught when he was a cadet at West Point. So he's not well. And Ewell has not ever been right since he was wounded at 2nd Manassas in August of 62, and has had his leg amputated and has gotten married. He's a quirky man anyway. So Lee's got a problem. And then when he puts Richard Anderson in charge of the 1st Corps, because they want somebody, Anderson not the best qualified, but he is a 1st Corps creature, and they want a 1st Corps person to be their commander. So Lee finds himself weakened dramatically as he moves in response. But Grant has got the upper hand. And so after the 2nd day, with Hancock firmly holding the Brock Road beyond the intersection, the Orange Plank and the Orange Turnpike roads, where there's been vicious fighting, Grant makes the determination not to turn back and lick his wounds and stuff and regroup, but rather to push through. Lee knows that this is what's going to happen. And so while Grant has the Brock Road and other established roads to march on, Lee does not. Lee's going to have to go cross country. And so after the night fighting on the night of May the 6th and 7th, Lee begins to, he sends Anderson to begin to cut a military road through the woods. And that race will be a close one, made possible because Lee then also uses Jeb Stuart to hold his right and to clog up the roads of advancement that Grant is going to use to move towards Spotsylvania Courthouse. Why Spotsylvania Courthouse? Well, there's a direct line to Fredericksburg and the Rappahannock River. So from that point, Grant can establish his supply lines based on Fredericksburg and the river. And so that is something that's really significant, and Lee understands that clearly. And so Lee races for Spotsylvania Courthouse, which still exists today in the town, and he sends Jeb Stuart out front, and Stuart clogs up the Brock Road and interdicts, and there's a vicious fight at Todd's Tavern a few miles from what will be the battlefields of Spotsylvania. But it's that operation that sets up the fighting at Spotsylvania. And because of the manner in which Lee deploys, Grant has now looked at the operation, and he's seen how Meade and Meade's corps commanders like Gouverneur Warren and Hancock and Sedgwick have all responded. And Grant realizes when he gets the reports back, there's one famous story from the Wilderness, and he's sitting at his headquarters, and he gets report after reports, and he says, "I am heartily sorry of hearing what General Lee is going to do to us. We should be thinking about what we're going to do to him. To listen to you is to think he would do a double somersault and end up in our rear and destroy us." You can see clearly that Grant is frustrated early on within just a few days of seeing operations. He won't relieve Meade, but he takes away a lot of Meade's discretion. And so what will happen around Spotsylvania will be the transition of Meade being in command and Grant now beginning to take tactical command of the army that goes there. He'll be punctuated by just barely losing the race and then losing one of his corps commanders when John Sedgwick is taken down by a sniper right after the army begins to arrive around the Spotsylvania lines. So this is an introduction basically to give you some background in the Overland Campaign and how it got there and why Spotsylvania is important. So I realize it's a bit longer than I would normally do for an introduction, but absent Gordon's outstanding presentation, I felt it necessary to give you the lead in to this to set up Bill's talk. So please join me in welcoming Bill Matter.
Thank you, Len, for those kind words. I'm really happy to be here. It seems like I've spent most of the last 17 years driving between Hartford, Pennsylvania and Fredericksburg, back and forth for one reason or another. But I'm always happy to come back down, especially...
Excuse me, could you speak a little louder or...
Okay.
The microphone, please.
Could I have some water then? I know.
Is there a mic? Yeah.
Always enjoyed coming down here for whatever reason, especially something like this with a group several years. I was also going to mention, I'm sure my voice is going to abandon me. I just hope it's near the end and not at the beginning. I only get to do this about once or twice a year. As you know, the Spotsylvania segment of the Overland Campaign entailed 2 weeks of operations in a relatively small area of Northern Virginia. And I learned very early on that it's impossible for me anyway to try to describe those 2 weeks in anything less than about 2 hours without eliminating things that I don't want to eliminate, so I gave up on doing it that way. So instead I'm going to concentrate on probably the most spectacular and critical and important, and certainly the bloodiest portion of the 2 weeks, which was the struggle for the salient in the center of the Confederate line, primarily on May 12th, about a third of the way through the 2 weeks. I'll pick up where we left off yesterday with Gordon, and very quickly and briefly give the events that led up to the formation of the salient by the Confederates, why they did it, knowing that it's a kind of a dangerous thing to have, and also the events that led the Federals to decide to make a massive attack against it, which is what the May 12th was about. This is just a general map of the area. You see Fredericksburg through Chancellorsville going out the Orange Turnpike through the wilderness you were yesterday, down the Brock Road to Spotsylvania Courthouse, the village. Gordon yesterday left us with me receiving orders in Burnside separately to move by various stages. I'm not going to get into much of the detail, it just isn't time. Gordon also mentioned that there are indications that A.P. Hill is approaching fiend illness and wasn't acting right. He was so bad late on the 7th, and by early on the 8th of May, he was unable to mount his horse. He had to ride in an ambulance for the entire 2 weeks. Excuse me, and Jubal Early was pulled out of Buell's 2nd Corps and put in command of the 3rd Corps for the 2 weeks. And then Hill, when they started to leave the area, resumed command. Early went back to his division. The 5th Corps, Federal 5th Corps, moved down the Brock Road on the night of 7th, 8th. Lee had no idea that where they were going, but he assumed that Spotsylvania would be a good place to go, because the only other place they could go would be back to Fredericksburg, where it wouldn't be any real hurry, but that they were going south, he wanted to know about it. So he sent his 1st Corps with orders to go to Spotsylvania Courthouse. Their route was a little bit to the left or west of the Brock Road, heading the Catharpin Road down to Shady Grove Church, and then over and up to about a mile and a half northwest of the village is where the two collided in the morning of May 8th on Sunday. Richard H. Anderson had been selected to replace Longstreet in charge of the 1st Corps. And the Confederates, with longer ways to go, nevertheless won the race. And the rest of the day was more units from each army showing up and fighting to a stalemate. The next day, the 9th, completed it. Early 3rd Corps finally came around by a roundabout route. Burnside's 9th Corps was the one who went to Chancellorsville down and came out on the Fredericksburg Road to the right from the village. And the other one got in place. And one significant thing, a few significant things on May 9th, General John Sedgwick was killed by a sharpshooter's bullet. He was commander of the Federal 6th Corps. He was replaced by Horatio Wright, who would command the Corps for the end of the war, till the end of the war. Also, the entire Federal Cavalry Corps, the Army of the Potomac, departed. This was because of a squabble that Meade and Sheridan had during lunch on the 8th, during the finishing touches of the movement, arguing about whose fault it was of the messed up march discipline and everything else the night before. It almost must have been like a screaming match. And Sheridan at one point said he knew he could whip Stewart if Meade had just let him loose to do it, so he stomped off, and Meade reported this to Grant. And Grant realized that these two weren't going to be able to work together. There's a superior subordinate relationship. And he didn't want to lose either one of them, so he saw one temporary solution was to say, well, let him go if he thinks he can. But unfortunately, he took the whole 3 divisions with him, leaving Meade with about 5 cavalry regiments. 3 of them were escorting wounded from the Wilderness back to Fredericksburg, so they didn't have much support at all. Stuart took off in pursuit. He only took one of his, Fitzlee's division. He left Wade Hampton and Rooney Lee, one on each flank of the army. This would make a tremendous difference throughout the whole 2 weeks, the disadvantage the Federals were at. And of course, this raid ended up with Stuart's more wounding down at Yellow Tavern, but they would miss Sheridan's horsemen until he finally did get back, as we'll see just in the things leading up to the 12th. The only special operations late in the afternoon, well, let me give you the Corps lineup. Hancock's 2nd Corps, let me get all shaky out here. These lines, the Confederate line ran about, right now, about like that. Hancock was on the right with the 2nd Corps, then Warren's 5th, then Wright's 6th, and Burnside, of course, was over back in here and crossing. He actually got across into here eventually. All this moving around is preparatory thing. Hancock got across, but he could have come up Shady Grove Church Road in on Lee's flank, but it was too late in the evening. They decided to wait. Hampton, of course, once he was pushed back, informed Lee. Lee sent a division out that evening, so the next morning it wasn't going to be a walkover. Grant decided to cancel it. We're now on the 10th of May. Got Hancock back across the Bow River there with some fighting. Then it was decided that they'd have an overall attack at 5 p.m. that afternoon. All 4 corps would advance, which is easy to say, but it's never worked yet that I know of in the Civil War. Warren had been getting more and more reluctant to attack where his position was on Laurel Hill, which was an open area. But for some reason, about 2 o'clock, he told Meade he'd be willing to attack right away. He thought he saw an opportunity, so Meade let him go, and it was unsuccessful, and this threw all the timing off. So they delayed it from 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock. And so I should have got to this sooner, but no, not yet. Now we're okay. This gives you an idea of the lines. The Brock Road coming down. This is a Confederate works across. The salient was constructed mostly on the 9th with the entrenchments. You can see why it's called a mule shoe or a salient in the line. From the apex down to near the road behind is about a mile. It's about 1/2 a mile wide at its widest point. The only reason I've ever found as to why the Confederates wanted to man it that way instead of perhaps a straight line more like that was that they thought that Federal artillery, if allowed out near the top of it, the apex, could interdict this road back here, which was the main connector between the 2 flanks of the army. It's the only reason I've ever seen as to why they thought it'd be all right. I mean, it's sort of a higher position in a way. You'll see that hopefully this afternoon, but the engineers approved it. They said, we think it can be defended with lots of artillery there, but otherwise not. And Lee agreed. And so they went to work constructing them. Let me give you these lineups again. On the left where it says Longstreet, who is wounded on his way to Richmond by now, that's Anderson's corps. Ewell's 2nd Corps had the real part of the salient. and early 3rd Corps connected on the right down through the village and further on. That would be the lineup for them. Opposite them, of course, would be Hancock 2nd, the 5th as far as the Brock Road, then the 6th to the east of the Brock Road, up to about the Brown House near the top. And Burnside's over here. There's a break from the Brown House down. Hancock 2nd Corps had 4 divisions. One of them was Gershom Mott's 2 brigades with about 7 regiments apiece in them. They had about 200 men per regiment. That's why it was kind of weird brigades. They were sent over to the Brown House, separated from the rest of the 2nd Corps, to attempt to make some kind of a connection with Burnside's right. The maps were terrible. They had no idea the distances involved. And this was all done during the 9th. Now, the works that were built in the top portion, the knob of the salient, were the standard. They dig a trench, throw the dirt out in front. The line ran along the edge of a wooded area. It was clear out to the front. They would get 2 sets of tree logs in the ground and then cut more logs, lay them across up to about breast high. In many cases, they built head logs above the top one, so when they're firing, their head would be protected for the few seconds that they were up firing. There are 2 angles of importance. The apex, which I call the east angle, 300 yards or so down. The west angle, the one which would become the bloody angle. Just to the right or east of the bloody angle, there was a 20-foot oak tree standing back of the line a little distance, which they didn't bother with, probably because of its size. It would take half a day to chop it down, I imagine. However, it would come down before the night was over. Okay, we're back on the 10th again. I got a little ahead of myself. We're back now where we belong. For this combined attack, everybody's supposed to try to find a spot, each corps, when they thought in their front that would be a good place to try to attack. And in the 6th Corps, one of the engineers took Horatio Wright in this general area right there. There was a field that ran 250 yards out from the Confederate works, and they got within the trees, this engineer and the general. On their hands and knees, there were no pickets out by the Confederates, and they could see across this field. They thought, well, we get a bunch of regiments, we ought to be able to get across there in about a minute and a half or so, and maybe we could do some damage. This is the significant part of all the operations on the 10th as far as subsequent events are concerned. This shows the attack. They gave 12 regiments to Emory Upton down here. This is the apex, the west angle. Here we're going down the west side. Laid in the woods there. And it changed from 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock. They were supposed to attack after a brief artillery bombardment. However, here's Mott up at the Brown House, which is up here. He was supposed to attack simultaneously with Upton to try to keep troops from bothering Upton that were opposite Mott. Now, Upton had 250 yards to go. Mott would have almost 10 times that much, and much of it through woods, so you can see that there was no way that Wright was, without even any maps, was going to be able to coordinate that. But it doesn't matter because the change of order from 5 to 6 never got to Mott anyway, so he came out at 5 o'clock, came down. This is Landrum House. There's a road there. It's on the top of a ridge. He came out of the trees, and the Confederates were waiting for them. They let go a few rounds of artillery at him. The 2 brigades turned around and skedaddled back up, and that was contribution of Mott's division to the day. 6 o'clock came. Upton's men got to their feet, charged across. Opposite them were George Dole's brigade, which consisted now of 3 pretty deleted Georgia regiments. They were caught completely by surprise. They broke through, captured many of them. The Stonewall Brigade of Johnson's division was the next one up the line to the left. The two left regiments of that brigade skedaddled that direction. The 12 regiments broke through. Some of them tried to go left, they didn't get far. Some of them went out into the McCool field. Many of them went right and temporarily captured a battery down here. In other words, the initial impact was wonderful, but there was nobody to follow up anything. So, John B. Gordon was Allegheny Johnson's 3rd Division. He was in reserve back here. He was able to send troops up, and they pushed Upton's troops back out. That evening, after dark, Wright went over to report to Meade. Meade and Grant had been west of the Brock Road all day, monitoring the operations there with Warren and Hancock. They went over and explained to Meade how this attack had gone, and Grant was there listening. And supposedly, this gave Grant the idea that 12 regiments can break through that easily. I wonder what an entire corps could do. So that is how the plan began to be formed. And the plan was for the 2nd Corps to move up and join their other division up here, all 4 divisions, at 4 o'clock in the morning on the 12th of May, attack down here. Now, they didn't know what was down here. They weren't even sure that there was a bend, really, but they knew that generally, since Burnside was kind of facing west and everybody else was either facing east or southeast, they knew there was a big bend. So that's all they knew. They didn't know where it was or anything else. No cavalry around to find out. In addition, the 5th Corps would now become the right flank of the Army. It, in the 6th, during this attack, would push up close to opposite their positions to keep the Confederates pinned down from sending any help into the center. Burnside was, if possible, to send 2 of his divisions up and cut into the east face just next to wherever the 2nd Corps happened to be and join that way. That was the plan. After the breakthrough in Dole's position, Lee and some troops in the rear begin to construct what will be known as Lee's final line, and the earthworks that are there are still very well preserved because they really weren't used that much. They're not as good as the ones at Cold Harbor, but I don't know if you'll have time to see them, but they're really something to see. A line that ran right back here. Whether he intended at a specific time, if nothing else happened, to move back voluntarily or not, I don't know, but anyway, they start. Okay, now we're on May 11th, the day before. With the 2nd Corps going to be pulling out of the right that night, they wanted to make sure there wasn't any Confederate force up there lurking, so they sent reconnaissance. They sent a regiment all the way back up to Todd's Tavern on foot because there wasn't any cavalry, which wore them out probably for 2 more days of work. They sent some regiments across the river. Hampton just skirmished with them and drove them back, and they saw well, there's nothing there other than the cavalry that's usually there. So they were satisfied on that count. Mott was ordered to send a regiment down roughly the route that the 2nd Corps would take. He picked the 26th Pennsylvania. They went out and ran into this Federal picket line, skirmished a little bit, turned around and went back. Lee, if he was ever told about that one, he probably never even attached any significance to it, but that was the one indication of what the Federals might be thinking of doing. Another thing which is really mysterious on this day was in the afternoon, the 9th Corps, which is in this general area here, pulled back across the Nye River. By now it had started to rain. The The Confederates saw this, they reported it to Lee. And when they got over there, they stood there in a thunderstorm for an hour, then the orders came out, that was a mistake, go back. They'd already destroyed the bridge, so they had to kind of shinny across the bridge streamers, the whole 9th Corps. They did get back in position by about 10:30, but the Confederates never knew they came back because it was raining so hard and it was dark. However, when Lee was told that they were moving, he began to suspect, well, maybe the whole army's going to pull out to the east, probably tonight. And if they do, he wanted to hit them in motion, even in the dark. Which means that everybody had to pull back fast and get moving. And he was concerned about some of the artillery pieces, primarily in the salient, that would be difficult to get out fast if they wanted to move fast. He sent a blanket order to everybody in the army, to the artillery chiefs, to pull out just after dusk any guns that would be difficult to get out at night in a hurry. The only ones that were pulled out were guess where? Way up at the apex of the salient and starting down the east side of the way, because there was just a very thin woods trail that they'd come in on over here. The ones on this side could come back down a fairly good road. So at dusk, 6 batteries pulled out. Nobody bothered to tell Allegheny Johnson, whose division was there in the middle, why. He asked what was going on, and the gunner said, well, nobody told us, but we heard there's probably going to be a movement of the army tonight, and that's all he was told, so he just had to say, well, I hope they know what they're talking about. Late in the afternoon, Meade called a meeting of his 3 Corps commanders, Hancock, Warren, and Wright. In very general terms, the plan of the attack was explained to him and how important it was. And Hancock, whose 2nd Corps would be bearing the brunt of this, naturally had some questions about some nice things like what is the terrain like, what are the enemy's works like, is there much artillery, are they fully manned? And he soon found out that no one had any idea at all about any of this. So it was decided to send somebody over to try to find out from the ground house. So Grant's chief engineer, Lieutenant Colonel Cyrus Comstock, and Hancock's chief of staff, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Morgan, and an aide of Hancock's, Major William Mitchell, were sent over to the Brown House. They lost their way in the rain and ended up clean over in the 9th Corps lines, but they finally got back to the Brown House about dusk. They found Mott and asked him if he had any information about the Confederate position opposite him. He just kind of pointed south. That's all he knew, or all he cared about knowing. So they went out on their own, and they went up to approach the rear, so I didn't mean to hit that, but hit the rear end of Mott's picket line. It was almost dark now, on their hands and knees, and they said, they couldn't see anything ahead, but they said, well, here's where we'll line them up. And this is kind of a rough way to do things, but that's how they did it. Then back at 7 o'clock, Hancock called a division commander meeting. Francis Barlow, John Gibbon, David Birney, and of course Mott was already over where they were going. And Barlow was going to be the head of the ground part of the attack, so he wanted to know the same questions that Hancock had been asking High Authority, and Hancock said, don't worry, we don't know anything now, but have your troops here at 10 o'clock tonight, ready to go, and there'll be engineers lead us and explain everything. So, okay, so they moved into position. They were there at 10 o'clock. Morgan, this Colonel Morgan, was leading the way. He was the chief of staff of the 2nd Corps. After a little while, Barlow asked him, what do you know about this? And to Barlow's disgust, he found out that Morgan didn't know any more than he had earlier in the day. And there was a Captain Mendel of the engineers that was also riding at the head of the column, because he'd been through the area and he knew a better road, a little shorter. So Barlow was exasperated about this. But Morgan was furious. And the way it's worded, he began to profanely abuse all his higher authority, beginning with Hancock all the way up to Lincoln and probably beyond there, for the way that the campaign had been conducted so far. He said he was almost shouting profanity as they were riding along. And after a while it got so ridiculous that, look, you can understand, here he was leading the entire corps in a position for an attack, and nobody knew anything about the enemy's position or anything else. So Barlow finally relaxed. There wasn't much he could do, but then it got so funny to him, he said he had to end up holding onto his horse's pommel with both hands to keep from falling off. He was laughing so hard. This is the way they're moving into position for this attack, at least the head of the column. At one time, Barlow was supposed to have said to Morgan, when you get us to wherever you're leading us, I hope you line the troops up in the correct direction so that they don't have to circumnavigate the earth and come up in the Confederates' rear. And this probably did nothing to soothe Morgan's feeling, but eventually they got to the Brown House. You can use this map now. Up the top, Barlow told, Hancock, by the way, wasn't with the corps in that advance. He came along later by himself with his Sullivan staff. Barlow told the men, let the men get any sleep they can get. He went in the house looking for some instructions. Mott was there, still just pointing south. But there was an officer that he found that helped him a little bit, that helped Barlow. Lieutenant Colonel Waldo Merriam, the 16th Massachusetts. He had been Mott's officer of the day on both the 10th and the 11th. And on the 10th, he participated in that very short advance they made. And also on the 11th, he'd gone with the 26th Pennsylvania on that reconnaissance. And he got some fleeting views of the Confederate works way out ahead of him. And inside the Brown House on a wall, in one of the rooms, he drew a sketch for Barlow. After Barlow explained where his troops were going to line up. Merriman explained that they'd be in this a treeless corridor kind of, and they'd start down through that corridor on a certain course, and when they got to the open fields of the Landrum farm, Merriman thought that if they maintained that same regular course, they should hit the works where they wanted to. And to his dying day, Barlow swore that was the only guidance he had as to what direction to march. Hancock called another council of war later that evening. Barlow again asked if there was any more information. And someone volunteered the opinion that he thought that the distance to be traveled was a little more than a mile, which wasn't a whole lot of help. So Barlow facetiously asked if there was a 1,000-foot chasm between where his troops were going to start and the enemy's works. And no one could honestly say that there wasn't. He said, well, in this situation, I'm going to make my formation as I choose, and it's going to be almost a solid mass for my division. And somebody said, well, you know, Mott earlier was stopped almost completely by artillery. That would make a wonderful artillery target. And he said, well, with the poor visibility, I thought I could get close enough that the artillery wouldn't have much chance against me. So it was agreed that way for Barlow's division. Now, this doesn't sound like the way Hancock would carry on a council of war, but I feel that he probably silently agreed with Barlow that with the lack of intelligence, it'd be best to go in with a big group to take care of anything they might run into. But at any rate, that's the way it was set up for Barlow's division. 300 men wide, 20 deep. They were broken up a little bit by brigades and regiments, but not for long once they got moving. To the right of Barlow, Birney's division lined up in the more conventional two deployed lines. Mott would get in the second line, and Gibbon, who was late getting over from the original position, would bring up the rear. The front lines of Barlow and Birney's division numbered 11,000 about, and all four of them together would number 19,000 for this attack. The fog started to form and the visibility around 1 o'clock now, 2 o'clock, was down to about 50 yards. Meanwhile, over the Confederate side, and these black circles are Confederate picket line, by the way, there and here. And all these troops started showing up. These pickets could hear them, although it was now raining steadily. They sent back for an officer. He came forward and listened, went back, and some more of them listened. It just sounded like a far-off sound of rushing water, they said, all this murmuring up there. So they woke Maryland Stewart up, whose brigade here was on the right of the line. He woke Allegheny up and said, I think we're either going to be attacked or the big force swinging around to the east. I think we ought to have those guns back. And Johnson agreed, and he sent a message to Ewell, whose headquarters were here, down here at the bottom of the Harrison House. Harrison House. There's Johnson's headquarters at the McCool House. Ewell hemmed and hawed, like, tried to explain why he didn't think it was necessary, because he thought they were going to move anyway, but he finally was convinced. He sent a message back to Johnson and said, okay, the guns have been sent for. They'll be in place by 2 a.m. He then took the message that Johnson had sent requesting the guns, endorsed on it, and sent it to his chief of artillery, whose camp was down in the village of Spotsylvania Courthouse, along with the 6 batteries that had been pulled out. The orders were to have the guns back in place by daylight. Of course, Ewell's chief of artillery was Lindsey Walker. The courier never got to his tent till 3:30 a.m. It's just dark, it's bad roads. And Lindsey signed the order and said the order said that we have them back at daylight. Lindsey said it's 20 minutes to daylight now. Everybody's asleep, including the horses, but we'll get them back as soon as we can. They went to work. One of a Major Page, who had charge of half of this artillery, he remembered he was woke up at 20 minutes to 4. So they got the artillery out of the courthouse, up the Brock Road, cut up, came up through, up along behind the line and got out to the salient. The commander there was hurriedly telling the batteries where to get in position. The one out at the apex pushed one of their guns forward, and all of a sudden they began shouting for ammunition. The Yankees were attacking. Now this is the slide that describes the attack. The shaded area is the extent that they reached, the maximum extent, temporary though it was. Hancock waited, it was still foggy, he waited till 4:35 before beginning. He thought it was starting to get a little light then, and he knew by the time they got there it'd probably be clear enough to see something anyways. So off they went. The Confederates were ready for them. I mean, when Johnson, after he sent the message in McWhitty, he alerted everybody, they got everybody awake. Some of the people in Witcher's little, what was left of Jones's brigade over here of North Carolina, or Virginia regiment, he had some of the men unload their muskets and put dry powder and stuff in them. Unfortunately, very few others did. But this is Rhodes's brigade here, then Allegheny Johnson's start. There is a little break here, then here's the beginning of the 3rd Corps to the right. James Lane's 5 regiments spread out. This is a weak place here. It said that John B. Gordon was in reserve. He had 3 brigades. One of them is still back here at the Harrison House, which is Ewell's headquarters. The other 2, during the night, when Johnson talked to Gordon and said, I'm really worried, he sent in his other 2. Evans's Georgians, Huckman's Virginians. They got in behind this little second line there. The guns were just being put into position. The 2nd Corps steps off. They had pioneers marching in the front with them with axes. They expected to run into Aberdeen. The orders were no noise until you got up close to the Confederate line, then let out a yell and charge forward. They went up past where maybe 100 yards. They came up on a little rise and ran into some Confederate pickets that were all asleep and captured them. Now they weren't these, they were way back here somewhere. They started up the back of this ridge where the Confederate main picket line was. They were awake, and they could hear and probably just at the last second could see what must have looked like every Federal Army soldier in the world coming at them. They all fired a shot, ran to the rear. Many of the Yankees thought, well, this must be the line because we got shot at and there's a little hill ahead. So they all yelled, ran up the hill and found nothing on this road except about 200 yards with nothing ahead of them except it was clear land. So they kept going, and by now everything was just about one solid mass, including Bernie's, portions of Bernie's to the right. About 150 yards out from the works in a little hollow, the Confederates had some amity, and the force stopped there. Engineers started cutting with their axes. Men threw down their muskets and tore the stuff out of the way with their hands. And this is when the Confederates were ordered to fire. They could see them at that range. York's Louisianans especially. There may have been one or two muskets that lit and went off. All the rest had just popped, so they hurriedly put new caps in, but the powder was too damp. Well, then the Yankees were running up the slope, and in they came, and there was some bitter hand-to-hand combat in this area. Eventually, 20 guns would be captured. Some of these guns got a few rounds off. The men on this side went down, both inside and outside the works. And that's when I mentioned that some of Stewart's people, when they built traverses, which are log walls to keep sidewise fire coming, they also put some across the rear end, and now they were sorry they did because they got trapped in there. They'd be firing outside, and people behind them would be taking them, and vice versa. But the officers lost control. Nobody was mounted in the Federal attack. So everybody just about did what he wanted to, but many of them came down this side and got in behind Lane's left two regiments and captured some of them before he could get them back and across. But by then they were starting to run out of gas and ideas and everything else. On the right, Bernie's men came in. A lot of them went out into the field. Many more turned right and against the Stonewall Brigade, which is Mark Walker there. The fog must have been especially thick. They could hear all this off to their right. They could not see anything. All of a sudden, here comes a whole pile of Yankees piling into the right of the line. I think the 4th Virginia was on the right. They were practically captured intact. And then there was bloody fighting down the line. The last Virginia regiment on the left got away and got over and joined Daniel to their left. The 2nd regiment, I think half of them got away. Almost all the rest were captured. And as it turned out, of Johnson's division, there were about 3,000 total that were captured. That quick with 20 guns, so that's quite an accomplishment. So far, so good. The 9th Corps, I don't treat that much because there isn't much information that's reliable, but they did come up late. They did join very temporarily with some of these Federals. But then the Federals eventually would get driven back, and the 9th Corps stayed down here just making little attacks throughout the day, but they weren't much help against anybody up here, as you see. Now this apparition, which I dreamed up in a weak moment, I'm sorry for it. It is the initial reactions of the troops that were available or close by to push the Yankees back out, which is exactly what they did. And now we're talking, say, 15,000 Yankees in there, and seems like it had taken an awful lot of pushing, but once they got in and got out of control, some of them became vulnerable. Okay, the first one is back here, the reserve that Gordon had left, Johnson. Gordon, orders were, don't wait for any orders if there's a breakthrough, just send whatever you have, do what you think's right. So he sent Johnson's brigade up into the salient. He knew there were people up in there. In the trees, the visibility was about 20 yards, 30 yards. The Yankees could hear them coming. They got a line there, and when they showed up, they just blasted Johnson's brigade, and they just turned around and broke into pieces and came back. That was fairly early. That was about 4:45. The next two were these two that were up here behind Huffman and the Georgia Brigade. Evans. As soon as the breakthrough occurred, of course Gordon couldn't see anything, but he pulled Evans back out as far as, about back that far. He could hear the Yankees going down that side, so he sent 3 of his Georgia regiments over there to try to blunt them. They ran into quite a number and got blunted themselves and got driven back also. Gordon also sent orders for Huffman to leave there and come back, which they eventually did. They came back here to the Harrison house. There was the other 3 of Evans' regiment and Robert Lee sitting on Traveler. Gordon had ridden over to help these other 3 Georgia regiments get out of their predicament. He came back, he saw Lee, he spurred forward, reported to him, asked for instructions, and then without waiting for him, said he intended to attack up the salient with what he had there. Lee nodded his head in agreement, and then instead of getting out of the way, he led Traveler up and stationed him right in front of the brigade and a half that was going to make the attack. So this was another one of those lead-to-the-rear incidents. Gordon tried to talk him out of it. He wouldn't even look at Gordon. So finally a sergeant of Huffman's Virginia Brigade just came forward and took the bridle and led him out of the way. He didn't complain or anything. Gordon shouted, the commander goes. These are Huffman's Virginians went up, drove these Yankees back. Some of them went out that way. Most of them went back up there. He chased them up to about 150 yards from there before there were plenty of Yankees to see him coming, and they fired. So Huffman stopped and stationed himself along there. The other 3 of Evans were on the right. They got handled a little rougher down here, but they eventually ended up also along the eastern face there. George Dole's 3 regiments that were pulled out of the line after their tobacco. There wasn't much left of them after the 10th, and nothing was through with them. When Lane announced he was in trouble way down here, they sent those 3 across. They got there just about the time Lane had reestablished his position, and they stayed there to be used if needed. I told you about Birney's men routing and capturing most of the Stonewall Brigade. When this happened, Rhodes pulled Ramseur out of his line on the left, moved him out into the field, and told him to retake that segment of the works. While they were getting lined up, they were being hit pretty hard by artillery fire. When they started forward, many of Birney's troops had moved out to the federal side of this second line, and that's where they clashed. Early in the advance, Ramseur was painfully, not seriously wounded. Byron Grimes took command for a while. Bitter hand-to-hand fighting back, pushed the Yankees back into the trees. Ramseur established himself along the line. The O is the oak tree, that's the west angle, that's the apex. So now we have, on the outside of the line, Confederate-wise, Ramseur's here, Huffman's here, and Evans' 3 regiments are there. And another one, Abner Parham's 3rd Corps Brigade was called up. He got as far as the McCool house, and after some delay, Ewell seemed confused. Gordon said, I'll take the responsibility, advance forward. or the Harrison House, I'm sorry. So Perrin led his troops forward. This is derailed. He gets killed very early in advance. He was mounted. They go across the McCool field, push the rest of the Yankees out, and then his men get scattered all over the place. Some of them end up down here, some of them are over here till the day's over. But they were the last major attack force, and now there weren't any Yankees on their feet left. They've all been pushed back out. This was by about 6:30 or 7 o'clock. Then, when this was happening and Hancock realized he was being pushed out, he called for Meade for some help. Meade told Wright to supply a division. Neal's 6th Corps Division was up about here waiting just for something like this to happen. About 6 o'clock, one of its brigades, Oliver Edwards, a bunch of New England regiments from Neal's 6th Corps, moved it down across the field, got into position about off the outside of the works near the tree there. And they began firing diagonally at Ramseur and vice versa. Ramseur was having trouble. He called back to Rhodes and said, "You better get some help on my right, or I'm not going to be able to stay up here." This was passed on to Lee, and Lee reacted. Now these positions as are of noon. Remember, we're still back about 6:30 in the morning. And what is there is Ramseur's here, and I missed these, but Huffman and Evans are over here, and Edwards is that little one right there with a small arrow here. That's the only ones on the outside of the line. However, soon the other 2 brigades of Neal's division show up. Bidwell and Wheaton, however, they're kept back in the trees in reserve, about 150 yards back from the line. So that's all we have now. Ramseur starts complaining. At 7:30, a Mississippi brigade from the 3rd Corps, Nathaniel Harrison, comes up from the Harrison House, stops at the McCool place for orders. They're still in marching column. They're waiting to get orders, when all of a sudden word comes from Ramseur again, "I'm going to have to evacuate this line pretty soon." So Rhodes gives one of his young aides the job of leading Harris's brigade across the field to put him on the right of Ramseur. About a third of the way across the field, the aide has second thoughts and turns around and gallops away back. Harris sends somebody after him, but he never found him. So there he is, standing in the middle of the field with all kinds of fire. One of Perrin's Alabama soldiers happened to be wandering by, and he told Harris about where Ramseur was, so they continued forward and got into the line on Ramseur's right. 2 hours later, at 9:30, there's more 6th Corps people coming in, not along the line, but back. More pressure on these 2 brigades. They pulled Samuel McGowan's South Carolinian Brigade, which is way down in the 3rd Corps with nothing going on ahead of them. They came back up, and they at least got in a battle formation at the McCool farm. They were said, "Go forward and get on Harris's right." Starting across the field, McGowan was slightly, painfully, but not seriously wounded. And Colonel Joseph Brown, commander of the 14th South Carolina, which was on the left of the brigade, inherited the command, although he didn't know it right then. They came in behind Harris's troops, who were firing furiously ahead. The Georgians said, "Get over on our right," so they slid over to the right, opposite the tree, and a little further up to their right, past the tree. The rest of the morning, the other 2, Russell's division comes in, that's up in some of these, and at noon, Ricketts, so the whole 3 divisions of the 6th Corps are now opposite the position of these 3 brigades, and that's the way it will be the rest of the day. Further up the line is the whole 2nd Corps. They're still milling around trying to get reorganized. There are no Confederates from McGowan's right down 150 yards to where the beginning of Huffman's left is. That's the way it would be the rest of the battle. The Second Corps didn't, we'll get into why perhaps a little later on. But the perimeters were then set up for intense firing. There was some artillery sent forward to Upton at his request. And just as they got there, he was about 300 yards back, he said, from the line. He sent a section forward to be barred from the Second Corps. All the Sixth Corps guns were still back here firing blindly into the middle of the Salient. Some of the Mississippians climbed out over and came after Upton. And the guns with canisters stopped them and drove them back. But this is one reason why there was so much firing. The Federals didn't want to get put back any further. And they didn't know what was back here. They didn't realize how weak it was. So they kept a steady fire at the top of these works to discourage anybody from coming over. Likewise, the Confederates did the same thing. Out in front here, there's a slope. A slight slope goes down where the big barriers for 30 yards. Not very steep, but it was low enough that the front lines of these Yankees that were closest could lie there and fire at the tops of the headlogs. They shot most of the headlogs away. Laying back behind them, and they'd pass ammunition up to them this kind of thing. And this is the way it got set up to go on the rest of the afternoon. Meanwhile, way down here, this other line's being built, and it's understood that they're supposed to hold out until this line is finished to fall back to. Whether anyone ever told them that, I don't know, but once the troops got in the front line. It's hard to figure out sequences of what happened from the reports with all this confusion, but examples though, on the Federal side, like I said, they were laying in the mud out here, prone, firing, and if anyone has fired a high-powered rifle while lying prone, you know that the body doesn't give at all to the recoil. And there was a Henry Kaiser of 96 Pennsylvania. He survived this. The following evening, of the 13th, he decided to write a letter home and try to describe some of this. He couldn't even write. His arm was still so sore, his shoulder from the recoil. Some of them claimed they fired 300-400 rounds apiece. These are Federals. That's a little high to me, but there was a continual, tremendous amount of the people in the front lines here, including some of the Second Corps on the right. They were kind of firing down into Brown's right, but there was absolutely nothing in front of them that they didn't know. Another artillery story, I don't know if he was the chief of staff, he's the fellow who wrote the Sixth Corps history named Hyde. He might have been on Wright's staff, but he sent a section forward, but sometime late morning, I think, saw it just start up a little rise and turn back to do something. He never heard any more about it, and what had happened, it come up on a little rise and saw itself about 150 yards away from the Confederate line, and they started to swing into the battery position. About 2 or 3 companies of the Mississippians just happened to be loaded there, and they fired and killed every man and horse in the 2 sections. Many of the men were still sitting where they were sitting all through the day till they got shot off. Just firing. Not necessarily at people, but to keep people from getting a chance to come out. It's just wow. On the Confederate side, they were at least in some kind of protection, but the wounded, there was no time to anybody get wounded. They just, when they could, they drag it back, the body back out of the way from underfoot. It got all muddy ground, actually it got all churned up. The losses they would lose, they send, Brown would send to the left, because most of the losses were going to be on the right here, opposite the tree, and it was the angle. Pretty soon they had to start asking Harris to send some of his troops up, which he did, and by the time it was over, all of the traverses near the angle had both Mississippi and South Carolina troops in them. There was close combat across the works like accounts say, but some accounts would think that it went on the whole time. It didn't. It was just periodic. The captain had talked a few companies or maybe a regiment to get together, all at once they'd climb over and drop down in and start swinging. And other Confederates from outside temporarily overpowered the Confederates in there. Other Confederates would run up behind the line and come in and swing and stab and shoot and everything until they drove them out. This would be going on off and on. There was cases where Federal soldiers would climb up on top and fire, and their comrades would throw muskets up to them. They were firing almost straight down, and they'd maybe get 3 or 4 shots off before they'd be dispatched from inside. It's hard to picture this. I tried, but it is tough. Ammo resupply for the Confederates. There was nobody brought anything up. Some of Harris's men went all the way back down to about that far, and somebody just dumped a bunch of minis on blankets or something, and they crawled back across the field. They resupplied themselves. One account, 26 Michigan, a Miles Brigade. Barlow's division must have been Chris Calkin said it was the best regiment in the Army. But it was picked for special missions, and for some reason, about 1 or 2 o'clock, they got back together and got resupplied. About 200 of them left. They were ordered to come down on their hands and knees in front of all these other Federal troops. So they got opposite about where the tree is, near the angle. Then at a given signal, they all went up down into about 2 or 3 enclosures. And there was a mess in there, but they finally got driven back out again. But this gives you an example of what it must have been like inside those pens.
Who was that organization?
26 Michigan. It was Miles Brigade at Barlow. They were way up there. It's in the RR, it just seemed, what in the world? They had all these other troops that would have had to move maybe 50 yards. Okay, you have all these Federal troops, many of them opposites, no opposition at all. Why couldn't they have done more? I found a letter in one of many Hancock collections where after the war he's writing to this Colonel Walker, who wrote the history of the Second Corps, compiled it. About this, he said there was no designated officer in command. Wright and I were both corps commanders. He said if Meade or Humphreys or even Grant would have come forward and told us to do something, get organized, I'm sure we could have done more. In Hancock's defense, he's worried about his left flank. He doesn't know what's down here. He hasn't heard from Burnside for a while. In fact, what he does is build a line of trenches eventually to go all the way up to Lantern House to protect his left flank. That's what some of these people were doing in the afternoon instead of fighting. Meade, whose headquarters were about 1.5 miles back from the top, came to the Lantern House there, which is Hancock's headquarters. Sometime early afternoon, he watched. He must have seen all the fire and fighting going on down at this angle. In fact, nothing up there. He didn't do anything about it. Hancock and Wright were both there with him. Later he asked Wright, Meade did, is there a place where you think we could break through? And Wright said, I think we could break through where my troops are, but I've got to have some help. I have to have more than my troops. So 2 divisions from Warren's 5th Corps were sent over late in the afternoon, supposedly to help on some kind of a coordinated attack. One was sent to Hancock up at the Lantern House and never got there about dark. The other one showed up to Wright, and instead of saving them and gathering what extra troops of his own, he sent them up to replace his ones on the front line, and that ruined any chance at all of any Federal attack. About dusk, but Lee doesn't send anybody either. And there wasn't, well, there's other things going on, but my contention is that he never was aware of the severity of this till later. I'll explain that a little later. About dusk, 2 of Kershaw's brigades, which were along here, were moved over behind this reserve line with orders not to advance up to the fighting under any circumstances unless they were ordered to, no matter what happened up there. And he said, okay. So it got dark. The firing began to decrease a little bit. Just constant back and forth at this one area. Confederates naturally garnered their ammunition a little more, so many of them just sat down against the insides of the walls and weren't going to do anything unless somebody tried to come over again. Or there was a quick fire, but the Federals kept, there was back and forth fire. More 5th Corps units are sent up to the front. Everybody's exhausted. Many of the 6th Corps people fell asleep in the mud while they're firing. Sometime between noon and 2 o'clock, or midnight and 2 a.m., a 20-foot oak tree crashed forward into the Confederate works. It knocked one of the 1st South Carolina unconscious, I think, before it found it. It had been severed completely by Federal musket
Where
fire,
was
20
the
inches of wood.
Where was it?
Right about above the M and the down, just back of the line. Just up from the end, and about maybe 10 feet back of the line. The stump is on display at the Smithsonian's American Museum of History on Constitution Avenue. It's in a glass case, and the side facing the tourists is the side that was facing the Federals. You can see maybe 5 or 6 musket balls still embedded in it. I got permission to get around behind. I wanted to make sure that there weren't any Confederate balls in the back, and there weren't that I could see, so it was shot from earth, cut down by fire just from one side, which gives you another idea of the intensity of firing. After dark, Colonel Brown hasn't heard a word from the rear. He said, well, let's find out when we're going to be excused from this work. He sends one of these regimental commanders to try to find Harris. He can't find Harris to the left. He goes to Ramsey, and they say, well, we don't know either, but we've been ordered not to leave here under any circumstances, even though they weren't getting much fire by now. So he goes back and reports to Brown. Brown says, well, go on back behind them, down behind them, see what you can find in the rear. He goes all the way down, still artillery fire, just haphazard over any. Down to this line, talks to those 2 Kershaw. They say, well, we can't leave, so he goes back up. Brown said, well, you command the brigade a while. It was not much fire then. I'm going to go find Harris, which he did. But it just said a short distance behind the line somewhere. So they finally sent a courier down to Rhodes, who I think was still at the McCool house, and the word finally came back at 3:30 or a little after. You can pull back if you don't hear from us, because then we think that the line in the rear will be completed. So they do it. Number 4, this goes, that's pretty good indication. This final line now is roughly along there. Everything above there is going to be abandoned. Brown's and Harris's men slog wearily to the rear. Ramsey pulls out Kershaw, Huffman, and finally the Federals didn't bother them a bit. Casualties, Harris had 800 to begin with. He lost 400 of them with casualties, dead, wounded, missing probably. And I guess about a third of them was in the advance across the field in a marching column, where they were getting hit hard by artillery fire. McGowan's brigade under Joseph Brown had 1,100. They lost 451. These 2 are among the real heroes of this day, these 2 brigades. Their tenacity is almost unbelievable when you consider that they weren't getting any encouragement or help or anything. No logistic support or reinforcements. There's no line or staff officer of division level or higher had seen fit to come forward to visit them after they got established up there. This would be Rhodes, Rule, anyone you want to talk to about it. We fought their fight alone. The South Carolinians for 18 hours, and the Mississippians for nearly 20 hours under those conditions. And let me plug the Federals. That Oliver Edwards Brigade, which was opposite at most of this time, he was almost 24 or 5 hours because he got there at 6 in the morning and he wasn't relieved till 6:30 the following morning. 15 yards away from the Confederate works down a little slope. So at daylight, the Federals, some of Edwards' men probably, the other ones that were in the front lines opposite this west angle, they crept forward tentatively to see what they had won. They realized the Confederates had pulled back. Bruce Catton, writing about this area, wrote that there was nothing unusual about it except that it presented the most horrible sights of the war. Now, all wars present horrible sights, and our Civil War certainly had its share, but this must have been one of the worst. And they found in some of the enclosures Confederates lying 4 deep in the mud. Some of them had been trampled completely out of sight. When they left, they couldn't bother with wounded or anything else. They had to go fast, they said. Many wounded were pinned down underneath dead ones and couldn't move. The Federals saw this. Many of them became physically ill, but nevertheless, they jumped down in and helped get many of the wounded out as they could and probably saved some of them from drowning. It was getting full of water. Besides that, these Federals, when they come up the slopes to get to the works, they passed through the remains of many of their comrades' bodies that had been shot earlier. And many of these had been literally shot to pieces, the bodies. The remains were picked up in blankets later, and they're probably scattered among unknown graves in the Fredericksburg Cemetery. An Indiana soldier wrote home that he passed some battery horses that had laid out in the open, possibly that one where everything was killed in one volley, that were reduced to a thickness of 1 foot, laying there all afternoon and night. And even a poorly fed horse, if it's full grown, you can imagine how much musketry it must take to reduce it to something like that. With this gruesome picture of death, suffering, and destruction in mind, it's easy to think of this area as revulsion as a place of horror, which indeed it was on the morning of May 13th, 1864. But it eventually returned to its natural state, as these places always do, whereas now it can be beautiful on an October day. And finally, because of the degree of sacrifice, personal courage, and the devotion to duty which the common soldiers, North and South, exhibited here, I feel that the location is another one of those places in our nation which can truly be considered hallowed ground. Thank you.
Take questions? No question. Go ahead, Pat.
No, I'm not sure how to ask it. Okay, that they didn't realize that the Confederates' right was so poorly defended. There just wasn't any way for them to see that, the Federals to see that.
I don't know. There's one account of Huffman's people who were down the right side. Later on in the day, he thought he saw a few Yankees behind him in the woods. Now, they may have been lost, or Hancock may have sent a few little parties in there, but nothing was ever done about it. Hancock, after he got pushed back out, he wasn't through fighting by any means, but he knew with that many men in there to get pushed out so easy. No, that's one of the big mysteries. And that's why Meade didn't see something like that, especially when he was talking to Hancock and Wright and saying, well, why don't we do something? Because there was nothing there. There wasn't even anything at that reserve line halfway back. So if they could have got a big group through there again, it should have cleaned some things up and moved some people around in other parts of the line.
Can you speculate, can you speculate, the Confederate reinforcements have been put into the line early in the action, then held the line the entire day. What seems incredible to me is, given the force of the initial assault, and that both Rod Johnson and 3,000 men are swept away, the force that reinforced and held the line was subsequently smaller. It would have seemed to me that another concerted push certainly should have been able to put the reinforcements out.
Well, yes, without a doubt, but there wasn't anybody to organize. Grant and Meade were a mile and a half back from headquarters getting messages. Meade came forward at one time and looked, and then moved. Of course, it was probably 1:30, 2 o'clock by then, I don't know. The idea of the reinforcements being able to win against different bodies of men like that, but they were organized in an attack formation against people running around out of breath and dead tired in the woods. And it's easy to get them moving, I suppose. That's exactly what happened. I can't find any evidence of any other Confederates anywhere or anything being done.
Other questions?
Because it just seems to me from listening to you that both Lee and me were gripped almost with a state of lethargy.
Well, Lee was looking other places. He was concerned about his east, down where the 3rd Corps was. Now, there wasn't anything there except one division left of the 9th Corps, which did attack about 2:30. Not the salient, they attacked below the salient. But he'd already mounted a force that was going to go and attack them. So that must be where but he didn't seem to be concerned after McGowan's, Brown's people got in position and nobody else, and he knew Federals were pushed out. And nobody else making any concerted effort, then he looked for other things to do, but I don't think he knew how close run thing it was up there. But all that it needed was some organized, somebody with naval authority, and it would take 2 hours to get ready. They certainly could have busted through it. Now what would have happened, you don't know, but there wasn't much in front of them for a long distance. Just one of those things. Well, everybody's exhausted. I don't know when the guys up in the rain at the Brown House, they might have slept a little, but